Before we begin, tell me in the comments where are you watching from. I'd love to know how far our celestial stories reach. There are some wounds that never show on the surface. Some scars that bloom beneath the skin, like silent flowers, invisible to the eye but felt in every breath, every heartbeat, every quiet moment when the world falls still. Alara had learned to live with hers. She had carried it for 5 years now. This strange heaviness in her veins, this whisper of something ancient and divine that pulsed through her body like a second heartbeat. At first, she thought it was grief, then illness, then something she couldn't name. The doctors found nothing. The tests came back clear, again and again, as if her body was mocking her pain by refusing to show evidence of it. She went from specialist to specialist, each one more baffled than the last. They checked her blood, her heart, her brain. They scanned and probed and questioned. One doctor suggested fibromyalgia. Another mentioned chronic fatigue syndrome. A third, with kind eyes and gentle hands, suggested it might all be in her head, a manifestation of unprocessed trauma. But Alara knew. She felt it in the silver shimmer that sometimes flickered across her vision when she woke at dawn. She felt it in the way her dreams were no longer her own, filled with landscapes of impossible beauty, cities made of light, and wings that stretched across skies painted in colors that had no names. She felt it in her fingertips when she touched certain objects, the way they seemed to hum with recognition, as if responding to something inside her that shouldn't exist in mortal flesh. She had stopped telling people about it after the first year. The concerned looks, the suggestions of therapists and spiritual healers, the well-meaning friends who thought she simply hadn't processed her loss. Because 5 years ago, Alara had lost someone. Not to death, but to something stranger. A disappearance so complete, it was as if he had simply dissolved into air, leaving behind only questions and a ring she still wore on a chain around her neck. His name had been Cassiel, and on the night he vanished, he had kissed her forehead and whispered words she didn't understand. Words in a language that sounded like wind through crystal, like water over starlight. She remembered the way his hands had trembled as he held her face, the tears that had streamed down his cheeks, the look in his eyes that was both infinite love and infinite sorrow. And then he was gone, and she woke in the hospital 3 days later, recovered from an illness that should have killed her, with doctors calling it a miracle and no memory of how she'd gotten there. What Alara didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Cassiel hadn't left by choice. He had been pulled back, recalled to a realm that existed between breath and thought, between the visible world and the eternal one. He had been an angel once, before he fell in love with a human woman and committed the one sin that heaven could not forgive. He had shared his grace with her, pouring a fragment of his divine essence into her mortal veins in a desperate attempt to save her life. The curse was simple and devastating. What was given could not be taken back. What was divine could not remain in mortal flesh without consequence. Alara would carry that fragment of angelic grace until it either consumed her completely or found its way back to its source. And Cassiel, stripped of his wings and cast into a prison of light beyond the veil, would remain there until the balance was restored. But heaven had not accounted for one thing. Love, even when severed, leaves roots that burrow deeper than any curse. Alara stood at her kitchen window on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, watching the first snow begin to fall. The world outside looked soft, muted, as if wrapped in cotton. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and felt it again, that pulse beneath her skin, stronger than usual. It made her fingers tingle, made her breath catch. The sensation was becoming more frequent lately, more insistent, as if something inside her was waking up after a long sleep. She had stopped trying to live the life she'd once imagined. The career in art history, the friends who invited her to parties and dinners, the future she and Cassiel had quietly planned in those stolen moments when he thought she wasn't listening. Now she worked from home, translating ancient texts for universities and private collectors. It was solitary work, the kind that didn't require explanations or social grace, the kind that let her hide from the questions she couldn't answer and the life she no longer knew how to live. Her apartment was small but filled with light, lined with bookshelves containing volumes in languages most people had never heard of. Latin and Greek, yes, but also Aramaic, Enochian, and stranger tongues that seemed to shift on the page when she wasn't looking directly at them. She had always had a gift for languages, but after Cassiel's disappearance, that gift had intensified into something extraordinary. She could read texts that scholars had puzzled over for centuries, understanding not just the words but the intention behind them, the emotion woven into every syllable. It was how she made her living now, this uncanny ability to decode the indecipherable. Universities paid well for her translations, and she never had to explain how she did it. She would simply receive a scan of some ancient manuscript, sit with it for a few hours, and the meaning would unfold in her mind like a flower opening to the sun. Sometimes she wondered if this too was part of whatever Cassiel had left inside her, this ability to understand languages that touch the divine. But lately, something had been changing. The dreams were becoming more vivid, more insistent. She would wake with words on her lips in that same crystalline language Cassiel had spoken, with the taste of clouds in her mouth, with the sensation of falling upward. And sometimes, in the mirror, her eyes would catch the light in a way that seemed wrong, too bright, too clear, as if something was looking out from behind them. Once she had stared at her reflection for a full minute, watching as her irises seemed to swirl with gold, before blinking and seeing only her normal hazel eyes staring back. She had started keeping a journal of these incidents, documenting each strange occurrence with the methodical precision of a scientist studying an unknown phenomenon. The shimmers of light, the dreams, the moments when she could swear she heard wings rustling in her empty apartment. The times when she touched something and felt a jolt of recognition, as if the object was reminding her of something she had never known. Her latest entry, written just that morning, read, "The pulse is constant now. I can feel it every moment, like a second heart beating in rhythm with my own. Sometimes I think if I concentrate hard enough, I could reach through it, follow it like a thread back to wherever he is. But I'm afraid of what I might find, or what might find me." On the night everything changed, Alara was translating a medieval manuscript about angelic hierarchies. It was a commission from a private collector in Vienna, a wealthy woman who specialized in esoteric religious texts. The manuscript was beautiful, illuminated with gold leaf and painted in colors that still glowed after 800 years. It depicted the 9 choirs of angels, seraphim and cherubim at the top, closest to God, descending through thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, and finally angels at the bottom, closest to humanity. Alara had been working on a particularly complex passage about the laws governing angelic interaction with humans when she felt it. A surge of that pulse in her veins so strong it made her gasp. She looked down at the page, and her breath stopped in her throat. The words on the page were glowing, not metaphorically, actually glowing, with a soft golden light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. She leaned back from her desk, heart hammering, watching as the medieval Latin began to shimmer and shift, the letters rearranging themselves like living things. The text now read, in perfect English that somehow maintained the rhythm and poetry of the original. The bond between mortal and divine cannot be severed by distance or decree. What was joined in love will find its way home, even through the walls of eternity. When the borrowed grace reaches the heart of its keeper, the doors of heaven will have no choice but to open. This is not law but destiny. This is not curse but calling. Alara's hands trembled as she reached for the page, and the moment her skin made contact, the world exploded into light. She was falling and rising simultaneously, pulled through layers of reality like paper being torn. She felt her apartment dissolve around her, felt the solid world of matter and physics give way to something else, something that operated on principles her mortal mind could barely comprehend. Light and sound merged into a single sensation. Time stretched and compressed. She was everywhere and nowhere, a single point of consciousness hurtling through the infinite. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. She found herself standing in a place that couldn't exist. A vast hall of crystal and cloud, where pillars of pure radiance stretched up into an infinite sky. The floor beneath her feet was solid but transparent, and through it she could see stars, entire galaxies spinning in their ancient dance. The air itself seemed alive, humming with a frequency that made her bones resonate. Beings of light moved around her, some with wings, some with forms that shifted too quickly for her eyes to follow. They glided past with purpose, carrying what looked like scrolls made of condensed starlight, or perhaps conversations with souls she couldn't see. None of them seemed to notice her at first, and Alara stood frozen, trying to comprehend the impossible fact of her presence in this place. She looked down at her hands and saw them glowing from within, veins of gold threading through her skin like rivers of starlight. The pulse she had carried for 5 years was visible now, radiating out from her chest in waves of soft light. She was lit from inside, a lantern of mortal flesh carrying divine fire. "You should not be here." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonant and ancient, carrying harmonics that suggested it was many voices speaking as one. A figure materialized before her, tall and imposing, with wings that seemed to be made of condensed moonlight. Its face was beautiful and terrible, ageless and ancient, with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of stars. No mortal has stood in the Hall of Judgment in 3,000 years. Alara's voice came out stronger than she expected, surprising herself with its steadiness. "I didn't come here by choice, but maybe I was meant to. Maybe everything that's happened over the past 5 years was leading to this moment." The angel's eyes, silver and depthless, studied her with an intensity that felt like being read, every thought and memory laid bare. "You carry stolen grace. You are marked by a crime that shattered the laws of creation. By rights, you should have died the moment you crossed the threshold between worlds. The fact that you stand here breathing is an impossibility." "I carry a gift," Alara corrected, and the words came from someplace deep inside her, a truth she hadn't fully understood until this moment. Given in love, not theft. Given freely by someone who couldn't bear to watch me die. And I'm tired of pretending it's a curse, when it's the only thing that's kept me alive, kept me connected to him, kept me believing that love is stronger than whatever laws you think are absolute. Something flickered across the angel's face. Not quite emotion, but the shadow of it, like sunlight through water. Around them, other celestial beings were beginning to notice her presence, pausing in their eternal tasks to stare at the mortal woman who glowed with borrowed divinity. "You speak of Cassiel." The angel's voice softened, just slightly, and for the first time Alara heard something almost like sadness in it. The fallen, the fool who traded his eternity for a handful of mortal years. The angel who broke the oldest law and has paid for it every moment since. He saved my life. Alara felt tears on her cheeks, warm against her glowing skin. I was dying of something the doctors couldn't name, couldn't cure. My body was shutting down, and I could feel myself slipping away. And Cassiel, he couldn't let me go. He poured his own grace into me, knowing what it would cost him, knowing he would be punished, knowing we would be separated. Is that so wrong? To love someone so much that you'd give up heaven itself? The angel was silent for a long moment. Around them, the hall seemed to hold its breath, the other celestial beings pausing in their eternal tasks to listen. The silence stretched, vast and heavy, and Alara felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, judging, measuring, trying to understand how this small mortal woman had penetrated the heart of heaven itself. "The law is clear," the angel finally said. But there was something uncertain in the words now, something almost like doubt. What was given must be returned. The balance must be restored. Divine grace cannot permanently reside in mortal flesh. It will either consume you entirely, burning you to ash from the inside out, or it must return to its source. These are the only options. These have always been the only options. Then let me see him. Alara stepped forward, and the ground beneath her feet rippled like water, sending waves of light spreading out in concentric circles. 5 years. 5 years I've carried this piece of him inside me, feeling him in every heartbeat, dreaming his memories, living half in this world and half in his. 5 years of wondering if he's suffering, if he remembers me, if he regrets what he did. If you want it back, if you want your precious balance restored, then at least let me say goodbye. Let me see him one more time before you take the only piece of him I have left. The Hall of Judgment trembled, or perhaps it was heaven itself, confronted with something its ancient laws had never anticipated. A mortal woman demanding an audience with an imprisoned angel, powered by the very grace that condemned them both, standing in a place she should not be able to survive, and speaking with a voice that carried more authority than any human voice should possess. If this story is touching your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It truly helps me keep creating stories filled with light, love, and hope. The angel before her seemed to war with itself, wings flickering between solid and translucent, form shifting as if unable to maintain stability in the face of this unprecedented situation. When it spoke again, its voice had changed, layered with other voices, as if it was consulting with beings beyond Alara's perception. You do not understand what you ask. Cassiel is held in the depths of radiance, a place where light is so intense it becomes a prison, where the very substance of divine illumination is compressed until it is heavier than stone, harder than diamond. It is where we send those who have fallen, not out of cruelty, but because they must be contained until judgment is passed and balance restored. To enter would burn away everything mortal in you. The grace you carry would not be enough to protect you from that intensity. You would be destroyed, unmade, scattered into particles of light and memory. Then maybe it's time it stopped protecting me and started taking me where I need to go. Alara closed her eyes and reached inside herself, to that pulse, that second heartbeat that had been her companion through 5 years of loneliness and longing, and questions that had no answers. She called to it, embraced it, welcomed it fully for the first time since it had been placed inside her. She let it flood through her with an intensity that made her gasp, made her whole body arch with the force of it. I'm not afraid of burning if it means I get to see him one more time. I'm not afraid of being unmade if I can tell him that his sacrifice wasn't wasted, that I've lived every day grateful for the gift he gave me, even when it hurt, even when I didn't understand it. The grace inside her responded to her call like a living thing. It surged through her veins, her muscles, her bones, transforming her from the inside out. Her skin became translucent, then transparent, until she could see the light flowing through her like rivers of molten gold. Her heart beat in rhythm with something vast and eternal, and for a moment she understood what Cassiel had given her, truly understood the magnitude of it. Not just life, but a piece of eternity itself, a fragment of the divine consciousness that had existed before time began. The world shifted again, and suddenly Alara was falling through layers of light, each one brighter than the last, each one stripping away another piece of her mortal resistance. She felt her body becoming less substantial, her edges blurring, but she held on to one thing, the memory of Cassiel's hand in hers, the way he used to look at her like she was the only real thing in a universe of shadows, the sound of his laugh when she said something that surprised him, the warmth of his embrace when the world felt too cold and too hard. These memories, she realized, were woven into the grace he had given her. They weren't just her memories anymore. They were part of the divine substance itself, transformed by their passage through mortal experience, changed by love into something that had never existed before in all of heaven's infinite history. And then she was there, in a prison made of pure radiance, so bright she should have been blind, but instead could see everything with painful clarity. The depths of radiance was not a place of darkness, but of overwhelming light, compressed and concentrated until it had weight and substance. It was beautiful and terrible, a maelstrom of luminosity that would have instantly obliterated any normal mortal. At the center of it, suspended in chains of light that pulsed with their own terrible beauty, was a figure she would have known anywhere, even transformed as he was. Cassiel. He looked the same and completely different. The gentle man who had held her through nightmares and cooked her breakfast and read poetry aloud in her garden was still there in the shape of his face, the curve of his mouth, the way his hair fell across his forehead. But now she could see what he truly was, what he had always been beneath the mortal guise he had worn for her sake. A being of impossible beauty, wings folded against his back even in bondage, feathers that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight, eyes that held galaxies, swirling nebulae of thought and emotion, a presence that made the air itself sing with harmonics beyond human hearing. He looked worn, she realized with a pang, diminished, as if 5 years in this place had slowly been eroding him, eating away at his substance. The chains around him glowed white-hot, burning him constantly, a punishment that never ended and never became bearable. Those eyes widened when they saw her. Horror and hope warred across his face, emotions so strong they rippled through the light around him like waves. Ilara, no. You can't be here. The light will destroy you. You need to leave now before what? She walked toward him, and each step felt like walking through fire, like pushing through a substance that didn't want her to pass, that was actively trying to unmake her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Before I tell you that I've spent 5 years carrying you with me, before I let you know that what you did wasn't a curse, but the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, before I say that I would do anything, endure anything, to see you one more time, you're glowing. His voice broke on the words, raw with emotion that he had been holding back for 5 years of isolation and punishment. My Grace, it's changed. I can see it in you. It's not what I gave you anymore. It's become something else. It's coming home. Ilara reached him finally, stood before him in his prison of light, close enough to touch but not quite daring to. Not yet. That's what the manuscript said. When the borrowed grace reaches the heart of its keeper, heaven will have no choice but to open. Cassiel, I've been carrying you with me all this time. Not just your grace, your hopes, your dreams, your love, all the parts of you that you poured into me that night when you saved my life. And I think that's what they never understood. You can't separate grace from love when they're the same thing. You can't take back a gift that has been transformed by its passage through a human heart. She placed her hand over his heart, and the moment they touched, something fundamental in the universe shifted. The grace he had given her 5 years ago, that fragment of divine light that had been growing and changing inside her mortal frame, surged forward. But it didn't simply return to him the way heaven had intended. It couldn't. Because it had been transformed by its time in her, woven through with human emotion, human courage, human stubbornness, human love. It was still divine, but now it was something new, something that had never existed before in all the eons of creation. It was grace that had learned to hope when hope seemed impossible. Grace that had endured loneliness and questions and pain without breaking. Grace that had been tempered by mortality and made stronger for it. Grace that had discovered what the angels, in their eternal perfection, had never fully understood. That limitation can create beauty, that struggle can forge strength, that love becomes most powerful when it chooses to persist despite every reason to surrender. The chains around Cassiel shattered, not broke, shattered, exploded into fragments of light that scattered like startled birds, dissipating into the radiance around them. The explosion sent shockwaves through the depths of radiance, through the hall of judgment beyond, through every corner and realm of heaven itself. Angels across 1,000 planes of existence stopped and turned, feeling a tremor in the very foundation of celestial law. In the hall of judgment, the ancient beings who had held their position since the dawn of creation looked at each other with expressions that might have been shock, might have been wonder, might have been the first stirring of an emotion they had thought themselves incapable of feeling: surprise. In the highest reaches of heaven, in the throne room where the oldest and most powerful beings resided, conversations that had been ongoing for millennia paused. Something impossible had just occurred. A law that had stood since the beginning of time had not been broken but transcended, revealed to be not absolute but conditional, not eternal but evolving. When the radiance faded enough for Ilara to see clearly again, Cassiel stood free before her. His wings spread wide and shimmering with new colors, hues that seemed to come from the mortal world, from sunset and ocean, and the exact shade of Ilara's eyes when she laughed. His chains were gone, but more than that, he was changed. The diminishment she had seen in him was reversed, replaced by something brighter, fuller, as if he had been restored and then elevated beyond what he had been before. And Ilara herself was changed, not destroyed but transformed, standing in a place no human should survive with her hand still pressed to his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating in rhythm with her own, two hearts that had somehow synchronized across the barriers of mortality and divinity, across 5 years of separation, across the gulf that was supposed to separate heaven and earth forever. "What have you done?" But Cassiel's voice held no accusation, only awe. His hands came up to cup her face, touching her as if she might vanish like a dream. "You came for me. Through everything, across all the barriers they erected, you came for me." "I think," Ilara said softly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred, "I've shown them that love doesn't follow their rules, that when something is given freely, with complete trust and absolute devotion, it doesn't diminish either person. It makes them both more. Your grace didn't weaken by being in me. It learned. It grew. It became something greater than what it was. Because that's what love does. It transforms everything it touches." The angel from the Hall of Judgment appeared beside them, and this time there was no hostility in its expression, no stern judgment or divine disapproval. Instead, there was a strange kind of peace, and beneath that, the faintest hint of something that might have been joy. The law has been fulfilled. The grace was returned, but not as it was given. It has been refined by mortality, strengthened by human will, elevated by love. Such a thing has never happened before in all the ages of creation. We have witnessed the birth of something entirely new. "So what happens now?" Ilara asked, suddenly aware of her exhaustion, of the toll this journey had taken on her mortal frame, even protected as it was by divine grace. She swayed on her feet, and Cassiel caught her immediately, his arms solid and real around her, his wings folding forward to shelter her. "Now," the angel said, and for the first time in perhaps its entire existence, there was something like a smile in its voice. "We must decide what to do with a precedent. You have proven that the barrier between mortal and divine is not as absolute as we believed, that perhaps there are bridges we never allowed ourselves to see, connections we deemed impossible that are, in fact, the very purpose for which both realms were created." More angels were gathering now, drawn by the impossibility of what had occurred. They filled the depths of radiance, transforming it from a prison into something else, a gathering place, a council chamber where a new age might be born. Ilara, held in Cassiel's embrace, felt a moment of fear. Would they be punished for breaking rules that had stood for eons? Would the price of their love be even higher now? But then she saw it, in the faces of those ancient beings of light. Not anger, not even disapproval. Curiosity, wonder, hope. As if they had been waiting, all this time, for someone to show them that their own laws were not the end of all possibility, that there might be ways of being they had never considered in their eternal, unchanging existence. One of the oldest angels stepped forward, its form barely holding a shape, shifting between manifestations so ancient they predated human language. Its presence was so vast, it made Alara's head spin, made her feel like a single drop of water facing an ocean. When it spoke, its voice was like the first word ever spoken, like the sound that started creation itself. We have watched mortals for millennia, studied them from our distant heights, guided them according to laws we thought immutable. Sometimes we have envied them their brevity, the way intensity of experience is magnified by its temporary nature. But we have never understood what they understand instinctively, what they know in their bones and blood, that love is not a weakness to be controlled, not a variable to be calculated and contained, but a force strong enough to reshape reality itself. The ancient being turned its full attention to Cassiel, and even Alara could feel the weight of that gaze. Your wings are returned. Your place in heaven is restored. But you are changed now, marked by mortality in ways that can never be undone. You have tasted time in a way we never have, felt the urgency that comes from knowing an end exists. You may remain here if you wish, take your place once more among the eternal host. Or you may choose differently. Cassiel looked down at Alara, who was fading now, the mortality in her reasserting itself in a place that was never meant to hold human life for long. Her skin was growing pale, her breath shallow. Even transformed as she was still human, still bound by the limitations of flesh and blood. That's no choice at all, he said, his voice firm despite the anguish in his eyes. My place is with her. It always has been. If I must be mortal to stand by her side, then I'll fall 1,000 times over. I'll choose her every time, in every lifetime, across every realm of existence. Or, the ancient angel said, and now there was definitely warmth in its voice, something that sounded almost like affection. We could explore a third option. If mortality can transform divine grace, perhaps divinity can sustain mortal life. Not by making her an angel, not by erasing what she is, but by allowing her to exist as she is in both worlds. A bridge, a reminder, a living testament to what is possible when love is allowed to transcend all boundaries. Alara felt something settle into place inside her, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. The exhaustion lifted, replaced by a clarity so pure it almost hurt. She could see everything suddenly. The golden threads that connected every soul across every realm, the way love created patterns in the fabric of existence, the beauty of both heaven and earth, and all the spaces in between. She could see the web of connections that bound all living things, mortal and divine, in an intricate dance of relationship and meaning. You're giving us a choice, she whispered, understanding flooding through her. We are giving you a gift, the angel corrected gently, as you gave us one. The gift of seeing our own rigidity, our own fear of change disguised as adherence to law. The gift of understanding that rules created to protect can become walls that imprison. You may walk between worlds now, both of you. Teach others what you have learned. Show them that heaven and earth are not meant to be separated by an impassable gulf, but woven together in an eternal dance. Cassiel's arms tightened around her. Together. Always together. Always, Alara agreed, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones, her blood, her soul, deeper than the grace that still pulsed in her veins, more fundamental than breath or heartbeat. The hall of judgment dissolved around them, and they found themselves standing in Alara's garden on earth, though everything looked different now, clearer somehow, as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes, and she was seeing it for the first time. The snow had stopped falling, and the first rays of dawn were breaking through the clouds, painting everything in shades of gold and rose that reminded her of the light in heaven, but softer, gentler, filtered through the mercy of atmosphere and distance. Cassiel's wings were still visible, but translucent now, present but not overwhelming. He looked more human than he had in heaven, but more divine than he had when he'd hidden what he was. He was simply himself, finally. Completely. Angel and man, eternal and temporal, divine love manifest in mortal form. 5 years, Ilara said, leaning into him, letting herself feel the solid warmth of him, the reality of his presence after so long alone. I carried you for 5 years without understanding what it meant. You carried hope, Cassiel replied, pressing his forehead to hers, his wings folding around them both in a shelter that was both physical and spiritual. You carried faith when I had none, when I lay in those chains believing I had destroyed us both with my impulsive choice. You carried our love through separation, and pain, and doubt, and kept it alive when I thought all was lost. That's what reached me, Ilara. Not just the grace, but everything you wove into it. Your courage, your refusal to give up. You. Always you. She kissed him then, and it felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once. Around them, the garden bloomed out of season, flowers opening their faces to the dawn as if welcoming something new into the world. Roses that shouldn't survive in winter, unfurled petals of impossible crimson. Jasmine released its sweet perfume into the cold air. Trees that had been bare moments before suddenly hung heavy with blossoms, white and pink and gold. The neighbors, if they had been watching, would have called it a miracle. They would have been right. In the days and weeks that followed, strange and wonderful things began to happen. Not just in Ilara's garden, but spreading outward in ripples that touched the whole city, the whole country, eventually the whole world. Though few people understood the source, people who had been lost found their way home. Not just physically, though there were those too, wandering children and confused elders who suddenly remembered where they belonged, but spiritually, emotionally. People who had been searching for meaning found clarity. Those who had given up on love felt their hearts stir with possibility. Estranged families reached out across years of silence. Old grudges softened and dissolved. Prayers that had gone unanswered for years suddenly received replies, though not always in the ways expected. A woman praying for wealth found not money, but a vocation that filled her with purpose. A man praying for healing discovered that his body's limitations had taught him compassion he would have never learned in perfect health. A child praying for her parents to stop fighting watched in wonder as they rediscovered the love that had brought them together. Dreams became clearer, more meaningful, as if the barrier between the spiritual and physical worlds had grown thin and permeable. Artists woke with visions that translated into paintings that made viewers weep without knowing why. Musicians heard melodies that seemed to come from beyond the world, harmonies that touched something deep in the human soul. Writers found words flowing through them that felt channeled from some vast source of universal story. Some said it was a miracle, a divine intervention. Others called it a shift in consciousness, a spontaneous evolution of human awareness. Scientists proposed theories about changes in the electromagnetic field, about quantum resonance and collective neurological phenomena. Spiritual leaders spoke of a new age dawning, of prophecies fulfilled. A few, those with eyes to see such things, those sensitive to the currents of the invisible world, whispered about a woman and an angel who walked among them, teaching without words that love was the bridge between all things. They spoke of glimpsing wings in the corner of their vision, of feeling a presence that was both gentle and powerful, of moments when the air itself seemed to sing with a frequency just beyond hearing. Ilara kept translating her ancient texts, but now the words revealed themselves to her in new ways, showing layers of meaning she had never seen before. The manuscripts that had once been academic exercises became living documents, breathing truths about the relationship between heaven and earth, between spirit and matter, between the eternal and the temporal. She would sit at her desk with a text in front of her, and knowledge would flow through her fingers as if she was merely a conduit for understanding that had always existed but never found expression. Universities began to notice that her translations were not just accurate, but transformative. Students reading her work reported experiences of profound insight, moments of clarity that changed their lives. Scholars discovered that her interpretations opened up entire new fields of study, revealing connections between religious traditions that had seemed separate, showing the common threads of truth that ran through all human attempts to touch the divine. Cassiel worked beside her, helping people in quiet ways that most never noticed. A touch that healed more than physical wounds, that soothed traumas carried in the body, that released pain held for decades. Words that gave exactly the insight someone needed to break through to the next level of their growth. Sometimes just his presence was enough, a sense of being seen and valued that some people had never felt before. He would walk through the city, and birds would land on his shoulders. Stray dogs would follow him home, where he would feed them and find them families who needed the unconditional love only an animal could provide. Children would stare at him with wide eyes, seeing something their parents couldn't, reaching out with small hands to touch his wings that existed on a plane just beyond normal vision. Once, Alara watched him stop to help an elderly woman who had dropped her groceries. It was a simple act, something any good person might do. But as he knelt to gather her scattered apples and bread, she saw the woman's face transform, saw years of worry and loneliness lift like a physical weight, saw her straighten, smile, look at Cassiel with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The woman never said what she experienced in that moment, but she began volunteering at a shelter the next week, and eventually opened her home to foster children who needed a grandmother's love. They were not the same as they had been before. How could they be? Alara carried divine grace in her mortal frame, and Cassiel bore the mark of human love in his celestial essence. They were something new, something that hadn't existed before they found each other and refused to let go even when all of heaven said they must. They were living proof that the boundaries everyone accepted as absolute were actually permeable, that transformation was possible in both directions, that love could indeed bridge any divide. On quiet evenings, they would sit in the garden and watch the stars, and sometimes Alara could see the threads that connected them, golden and unbreakable, stretching up into the sky and down into the earth, binding them to both worlds. Sometimes they would see other angels watching from a distance, standing at the threshold between realms, curious, maybe even envious, as if wondering what it might be like to love so completely that you would risk everything. One evening, several months after Alara's journey to heaven, a young angel appeared in their garden. They both sensed it immediately, the shift in the air, the subtle brightening of the twilight. This angel was young by celestial standards, perhaps only a few millennia old, with wings that shimmered like dawn breaking over water. It stood at the edge of their property, neither entering nor leaving, clearly torn between duty and desire. Cassiel stood, extending his hand in welcome. "You're safe here. This is neutral ground now, recognized by heaven and earth alike." The young angel took a hesitant step forward. "I'm called Raziel. I was sent to observe you, to report back on what has happened since the laws were changed. But I came for another reason too." The angel's voice trembled with something that might have been hope or fear or both. "There is someone on earth. Someone I've been watching over for years. And I think I'm beginning to feel what you felt. What you sacrificed everything for." Alara smiled gently, recognizing the anguish in those ancient young eyes. "Then you're afraid. Afraid of falling. Afraid of losing your place in heaven. Afraid of what love might cost you." "How did you bear it?" Raziel asked, and the question carried the weight of genuine desperation. "How did you endure 5 years of separation, not knowing if you would ever see him again? How did you not break under the weight of carrying what was never meant to be carried?" "I broke every day," Alara said honestly, and Cassiel's hand found hers, their fingers interweaving in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Every single day, I broke a little. But every day, I also chose to put myself back together. Because the alternative was giving up. and giving up would have meant his sacrifice was wasted. It would have meant love lost, and I couldn't bear that more than I could bear the pain. Raziel sank to the ground, wings folding in a gesture of surrender that Alara recognized from her studies as a sign of profound vulnerability among angels. They're watching. All of heaven is watching to see what will happen next. Some are angry, saying you've disrupted the perfect order. Others are curious, wondering if perhaps the old ways were not as perfect as we believed. And a few, like me, are hoping that maybe there's a path forward that doesn't require us to choose between love and our nature. There is, Cassiel said firmly. We've proven it, but it requires courage from both sides. It requires mortals to accept that they can hold more divinity than they imagine, and angels to accept that their perfection might actually be enriched by experiencing limitation, growth, change. It requires everyone to admit that love is not a weakness or a danger, but the very force that gives existence meaning. Over the following months, more angels began to appear in their garden. Some came openly, seeking counsel. Others watched from a distance, too afraid or too bound by duty to approach, but unable to stay away. Each one carried the same question in different forms. Is it possible? Can we love without falling? Can we bridge both worlds without destroying ourselves? Alara and Cassiel welcomed them all, sharing their story not as a prescription, but as a possibility. They spoke of the pain, yes, but also the joy, the fear, but also the faith, the cost, but also the infinite value of what they had gained. And slowly, gradually, heaven began to change. It wasn't a revolution. Revolutions are violent, sudden, destructive. This was more like a thawing, like spring coming to a landscape that had been frozen since the beginning of time. Angels who had never questioned their role began to wonder. Humans who had never believed in miracles began to experience them. And in the space between, new possibilities began to emerge. One evening, as autumn turned to winter again, marking a full year since Alara's journey to heaven, they received an unexpected visitor. The ancient angel who had spoken at their joining appeared in their garden, its form more stable than before, as if it had learned something about limitation that gave it greater definition. I bring a message from the highest councils, it said, its voice still carrying that quality of multiple harmonics. There is to be a gathering, a convocation of all angelic orders and human representatives, to discuss the new covenant between heaven and earth. Your presence is requested. Required, actually. You are the architects of this change, whether you intended to be or not. Alara felt a flutter of anxiety. We're not leaders. We're just two people who love each other. Exactly, the angel replied. That's why your testimony carries such weight. You didn't seek to change heaven's laws out of ambition or ideology. You simply loved, and everything else followed from that. That authenticity is what's making even the most resistant among us question assumptions we've held since creation began. The convocation took place on the winter solstice, in a space that existed simultaneously on earth and in heaven. Alara could feel both realities at once, the cold stone of an ancient cathedral in Rome, and the crystalline perfection of a celestial hall. Humans filled the pews, religious leaders and mystics, philosophers and ordinary people who had experienced unexplainable moments of grace. Angels filled the upper realms, arranged in their traditional hierarchies, but with a tension in their ranks, a sense of anticipation that suggested the old orders might not hold for much longer. Cassiel stood with Alara at the center, in the liminal space between worlds. When he spoke, his voice carried to both audiences, bridged both realms. We were not trying to prove anything. We were simply trying to survive our love for each other. But in surviving, we discovered something that perhaps should have been obvious all along. That heaven and earth were never meant to be completely separate. That the whole purpose of creation might have been to create bridges between the eternal and the temporal, the perfect and the growing, the unchanging and the transforming. Alara added her voice to his, speaking from her human perspective, but amplified by the grace she carried. I was dying, and an angel saved me. That should have been the end of the story. A miracle, a gift, a mystery to be grateful for without understanding. But instead, it became the beginning of a new story. Because the grace he gave me didn't just heal my body. It opened my eyes to the connections that have always existed, but that we've been taught not to see. She gestured to the assembled crowd, human and angelic. Look at us. We're not as separate as we think. Every prayer is a bridge. Every moment of awe is a connection. Every act of selfless love is a joining of heaven and earth. Cassiel and I just made that connection visible, undeniable, impossible to dismiss as metaphor or wishful thinking. A human voice rose from the assembly, a woman in simple clothes with eyes that had seen too much suffering. But what about those of us who haven't been touched by an angel? What about those of us who pray and get no answer, who love and lose, who suffer without any divine intervention? What does your story mean for us? Alara felt the weight of that question, recognized the pain behind it. She had asked the same thing in her years of loneliness, wondering why she had been chosen for this impossible gift, while others suffered without relief. I don't have an easy answer. But what I've learned is that grace comes in many forms. Sometimes it's miraculous and obvious. Sometimes it's subtle, so quiet you might miss it if you're not paying attention. Sometimes it's just the strength to keep going one more day, the unexpected kindness of a stranger, the way beauty still manages to break through suffering. An angel spoke then, one of the older ones, with wings that seemed to be woven from storm clouds and starlight. The human asks a fair question. Why are some saved and others left to suffer? This is what we've struggled with since the first prayers rose to heaven. We are bound by laws that say we cannot intervene too directly, cannot override the free will and natural consequences that give mortal life its meaning. But this new covenant you've initiated suggests there might be more flexibility in those laws than we believed. Or maybe, Cassiel offered carefully, the laws were always more flexible than you allowed yourselves to explore. Maybe the restrictions you placed on yourselves were not divine commands but your own fears. Fear of getting too close, too involved, too changed by contact with mortality. A ripple went through the angelic ranks. Not quite agreement, but not disagreement either. The possibility settling into consciousness that had been set in their ways for eons. The convocation lasted 3 days, though time moves strangely in that liminal space, so it might have been 3 hours or 3 years by other measures. They discussed new protocols for angelic interaction with humans. They debated the nature of miracles and the ethics of intervention. They explored the idea that perhaps every human carried the potential to hold divine grace, if they were willing to accept it and be transformed by it. Not everyone agreed. Some angels insisted the old ways were best, that too much mixing of mortal and divine would corrupt both. Some humans argued that angels should stay in heaven and let humanity work out its own salvation. But even the dissenters couldn't deny that something had shifted, that the absolute wall between worlds had developed cracks, and through those cracks, new light was pouring. By the end, a new covenant was established, not as rigid as the old laws, but not as chaotic as complete freedom. Angels could choose to form deeper bonds with humans, but only with full understanding of the consequences. Humans could seek to carry more divine grace, but only if they accepted the responsibility that came with it. And both sides acknowledged that love, in all its forms, was not a violation of cosmic law, but perhaps the highest expression of it. As the convocation ended, and the assembled beings began to depart, the ancient angel approached Alara and Cassiel one final time. You have changed everything. You understand that, don't you? Nothing will ever be the same. Is that a blessing or a curse? Alara asked. The angel considered, its form shimmering as if uncertain. Both, perhaps. Change always is. But I believe, and this is the first time in my existence I've used that word, believe, rather than know. I believe it is ultimately a blessing. You've reminded us that we were made for relationship, not isolation. For love, not mere duty. For growth, not stagnation. After it departed, Ilara and Cassiel stood alone in the liminal space, watching as it slowly dissolved back into ordinary reality. The cathedral stones grew solid again, the mystical light fading to normal winter sunshine through stained glass. "Do you think it will work?" Ilara asked quietly. "Do you think heaven and earth can really learn to work together?" "I think," Cassiel said, pulling her close, "that we have no choice but to try. And we have the most important proof that it's possible. Us. We're still here. Still together. Still whole. Despite everything that should have destroyed us. That's not nothing." "No," Ilara agreed, smiling up at him. "That's everything." Thank you for listening till the end. Share what moved you most in the comments, and don't forget to follow and subscribe. If you're new here, welcome to our family of celestial souls. The years that followed were not easy, but they were rich with meaning. Ilara and Cassiel's home became a sanctuary for those caught between worlds. Humans who had experienced divine touch and didn't know how to integrate it into their ordinary lives. Angels who were learning to understand emotion and limitation. Children born to mixed unions who carried both mortal and celestial heritage in their blood. They established what they called the Bridge House, a place that existed slightly outside normal reality, where the rules that governed the rest of existence were more flexible. Here, a human could practice holding greater amounts of divine light without fear of burning out. An angel could experience mortality without fully falling. Beings from both realms could meet as equals, sharing wisdom and experience without the hierarchies that had defined their relationship for millennia. Word spread. People came from around the world, drawn by rumors of a place where miracles were not rare exceptions, but daily occurrences, where prayers were answered not by distant deities, but by beings who had learned to walk between worlds and were willing to teach others the same skill. Not all who came could master the bridge. Some humans found that their physical forms were not suited to carrying divine grace, or that the psychological demands of perceiving both realities at once was too much for their minds to bear. Some angels discovered that the vulnerability required for true connection with mortals was beyond what they could accept, that eons of perfect existence had made them too rigid to bend without breaking. But for those who could make the crossing, who could hold both mortal and divine within themselves without being destroyed by the contradiction, the rewards were profound. They became living bridges, conduits through which grace could flow more freely into the world. They learned to see the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the temporary, the divine spark in every living thing. One day, a young woman arrived at the bridge house, carrying a child who glowed with faint silver light. "His father was an angel," she said simply, her voice carrying both pride and fear. "He didn't fall. He didn't break any laws. We loved each other under the new covenant, with full awareness and acceptance. But now I have a son who is neither fully human nor fully divine, and I don't know how to raise him. I don't know what he needs, what he'll become, what his life will be like." Ilara took the child gently, feeling the familiar pulse of grace that she carried in her own veins. The boy looked up at her with eyes that swirled with colors not found in the normal spectrum, and she saw her own journey reflected there. The confusion, the isolation, the sense of being caught between worlds with no clear path forward. "He'll need both," she said to the mother. "Human love and angelic wisdom, mortal limitation to keep him grounded and divine grace to help him soar. He'll need to know that what he is isn't a curse or even just a gift, but a calling, a purpose." "What purpose?" the mother asked. Ilara smiled, thinking of all the years she'd asked herself the same question. "To show the rest of us what's possible. To be proof that the boundaries we think are absolute are actually just the limits of our imagination. To live as a bridge so that others can cross." The boy grew up at the bridge house, along with others like him, children born to the new covenant, who carried both worlds in their blood. They were the first generation to never know a time when heaven and earth were truly separate, when angels and humans couldn't love, when the divine and mortal were considered completely incompatible. Watching them play in the garden, human children and half-angels chasing each other between flower beds, while ethereal beings hovered nearby, offering gentle guidance and protection, Alara felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what she and Cassiel had suffered for. This was why she had carried his grace through 5 years of loneliness and pain. This was why he had endured imprisonment in the depths of radiance. Not just for their own love, though that would have been enough, but for all the loves that would follow, for all the connections that were now possible because they had been stubborn enough, brave enough, devoted enough to refuse to accept that heaven and earth must remain separate. "Do you ever regret it?" Cassiel asked one evening as they sat in their garden, now many years older, their hair touched with silver, though their eyes still glowed with the grace they shared. "The life you could have had if I'd never come into it? The normalcy, the simplicity, the ability to walk through the world without seeing all the layers most people miss?" Alara considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked it. He still worried, after all these years, that he had taken too much from her, changed her too fundamentally, stolen her chance at an ordinary, happy life. "I regret the pain," she said honestly. "Those 5 years of not knowing if I'd ever see you again, thinking I might be going crazy, feeling this power inside me that I didn't understand and couldn't control. I regret that. But the rest? Never. You didn't steal my life, Cassiel. You gave me a life that has meaning beyond what I could have imagined. You showed me that the world is so much bigger, so much more beautiful, so much more full of possibility than I ever dreamed." She took his hand, feeling the familiar thrill of their energies intertwining. "We were both broken by what happened. You lost your place in heaven. I lost my chance at normalcy. But in our brokenness, we found something more whole than either of us had been separately. That's what love does at its best. It doesn't complete you. That's too simple. It cracks you open and lets light in, even when the cracking hurts." Cassiel pulled her close, his wings, always visible to her, even after all these years, folding around them both. "I love you. I've loved you since the moment I was assigned to watch over you, before you even knew I existed. I loved you when loving you was forbidden. I loved you through 5 years of separation. I loved you when you came for me in a place no mortal should survive. And I'll love you until the stars burn out and time itself ends. And I'll love you beyond that," Alara replied, "into whatever comes after endings. Because that's what we've proven, isn't it? That love doesn't follow the rules everyone else accepts. It writes its own rules. It creates its own reality. It makes the impossible inevitable." As night fell over the bridge house, lights began to appear. Not electric lights, but the soft glow of grace manifesting in physical form. The children who lived there, human and half-divine alike, gathered in the garden for their evening ritual, a ceremony Alara and Cassiel had created that honored both worlds they belonged to. They sang songs in languages both old and new, human words and angelic harmonics blending into something that made the air itself shimmer. They told stories of the old days when heaven and earth were separate, so the children would understand what had changed and why it mattered. They practiced small miracles, healing minor hurts, making flowers bloom out of season, calling down starlight to dance in their palms, not as displays of power, but as exercises in understanding the grace they carried. And they prayed. Not to distant deities in far-off heavens, but to the divine presence that lived in all things, that connected every soul across every realm. Prayers of gratitude for the bridge that had been built. Prayers of hope for the future that was still unfolding. Prayers of love for all beings, mortal and divine, struggling to understand their place in a cosmos more vast and mysterious than anyone could fully comprehend. Alara watched them and felt tears on her cheeks, though they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. These children would never know the loneliness she had endured, the sense of being utterly isolated in an experience no one else understood. They would grow up knowing they belonged to both worlds, that they were loved by both heaven and earth, that they carried purpose and meaning woven into their very existence. "We did this," Cassiel whispered beside her. "You and I. We changed everything." "No," Alara corrected gently. "Love did this. We were just brave enough, or maybe foolish enough, to let it." In heaven, the changes continued to ripple outward. More angels were choosing to form deeper connections with humans, some even accepting mortality to be with those they loved. The angelic hierarchies, once rigid and unchanging, were developing new fluidity, new forms, new purposes. Angels who had spent eons in contemplation were discovering the joy of action. Those who had always served in perfect obedience were learning the complex beauty of choice. And on Earth, humans were awakening to their own capacity for divinity. Not in the arrogant sense of claiming to be gods, but in the humble recognition that they carried sparks of the eternal within them, that they were capable of more grace, more love, more transformation than they had ever imagined. The old barriers between sacred and profane were dissolving. People found divinity in ordinary moments, in the laugh of a child, in the comfort of a meal shared with friends, in the satisfaction of work well done, in the touch of a lover's hand. Heaven was no longer a distant destination, but a state of being that could be accessed here and now, in this world, in this moment. And hell was revealed not as a place of punishment, but as the isolation that came from refusing connection, from insisting on separation, from choosing fear over love. It was possible to create hell on earth or heaven on earth, and the choice was available to everyone in every moment. The story of Alara and Cassiel became legend, told and retold in countless variations. Some versions emphasized the romantic tragedy, the 5 years of separation and suffering. Others focused on the triumph, the moment when love conquered the laws of heaven itself. Some turned it into allegory, a teaching about the relationship between human and divine. Others insisted on its literal truth, claiming that anyone could verify it by visiting the bridge house and meeting the couple themselves. But the core remained constant across all versions: that love, true love, is the most powerful force in existence. That it can bridge any divide, overcome any obstacle, transform any limitation. That what was thought impossible becomes not only possible, but inevitable when two souls commit to each other completely, without reservation, without fear of the cost. On the anniversary of Alara's journey to heaven, they held a celebration at the bridge house. Angels and humans gathered together, no longer separated by species or realm, but united by shared purpose and mutual respect. There was music and dancing, food and wine, laughter and tears. Children played while elders told stories. Celestial beings and mortal ones stood side by side, marveling at how much had changed in just a few short years. At the height of the celebration, as twilight painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Alara stood to speak. The crowd fell silent, human and angel alike turning their attention to the woman who had started it all by refusing to accept that love must bow to law. "We gather here," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the garden, amplified by grace, "not to celebrate what Cassiel and I did, but to celebrate what love can do when we get out of its way. When we stop trying to control it, limit it, define it according to rules that were made by fear rather than wisdom." She looked around at the assembled faces, seeing so many stories reflected there. The young couple, one human and one angel, holding hands with a boldness that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The child with wings folded against her back, playing with her fully human friends, as if there was nothing unusual about her heritage. The old woman who had regained her faith after years of doubt, her face glowing with quiet joy. The angel who had learned to cry, tears streaming down cheeks that had never known moisture before. 5 years ago, I carried what everyone told me was a curse. A piece of divinity that didn't belong in mortal flesh, that should have destroyed me, that represented a broken law and a love that wasn't allowed to exist. But I've learned that what the world calls a curse is often just a gift we don't yet understand, a calling we haven't accepted, a transformation we're afraid to undergo. She reached for Cassiel's hand, and he stood beside her, his wings fully visible now to everyone present, shimmering with those impossible colors that came from both heaven and earth. We are all capable of carrying more than we think. More grace, more love, more divinity. The only question is whether we're brave enough to accept it, to be changed by it, to let it crack us open so that light can pour through. An elderly angel, one who had been skeptical of the new covenant from the beginning, stepped forward. His form was ancient, wings dim with age, voice wavering with the weight of millennia. I opposed this change. I argued that the old ways were best, that mortals and angels were too different to truly unite, that disaster would come from mixing what should remain separate. He paused, and Alara saw something unexpected in his ancient eyes. Humility. I was wrong. I have watched these years unfold, watched what happens when love is allowed to bridge worlds, and I see now that I was not protecting heaven's purity, but my own fear. Fear of change, fear of vulnerability, fear of discovering that the perfection I had clung to for eons was actually a kind of stagnation. The old angel turned to address the crowd. Do not make my mistake. Do not let fear masquerade as wisdom. Do not protect what is comfortable when what is possible might be so much greater. These two, he gestured to Alara and Cassiel, have shown us that the boundaries we accepted as eternal were actually just the limits of our courage. And for that lesson, I am finally, after an existence spanning ages, grateful. The celebration continued late into the night, and Alara found herself approached by person after person, each with a story of how their encounter with the new covenant had changed them. A doctor who now could see not just physical ailments, but spiritual wounds, and heal both. A teacher whose students suddenly found learning effortless, as if knowledge flowed directly from some universal source. A musician who could make angels weep with songs that carried the ache of mortality and the hope of eternity in every note. But the story that moved her most came from a woman her own age, with tired eyes and worn hands. I never met an angel, the woman said quietly. No divine intervention saved me from my illness. I just had good doctors and good luck. But hearing your story, knowing that what you experienced is possible, it changed me anyway. It made me believe that the universe is not indifferent, that there is connection and meaning woven through everything, that my small ordinary life matters in the vast scheme of existence. Alara embraced her, feeling the truth of those words settle into her heart. That's what we were really meant to show. Not that miracles can happen, but that everything is a miracle if you have eyes to see it. That the grace I carry isn't special or unique, just visible. We all carry it. We're all bridges between heaven and earth. We just have to remember. As dawn approached, most of the guests departed, angels returning to their realms and humans to their homes. But a core group remained, those who had dedicated themselves to the work of the Bridge House, to the ongoing project of uniting what had been divided. They gathered in a circle in the garden, human and angel, adult and child, veteran and novice. Cassiel spoke words in the angelic tongue, and Alara translated them into human language, though by now most of those present understood both. It was a blessing and a charge, a recognition of the responsibility they carried and a celebration of the joy it brought. We are the bridge builders, Cassiel said. We are the ones who remember that separation is illusion, that love is the fundamental force binding all things, that heaven and earth were never meant to exist in isolation from each other. We are the wounded healers, Alara added. We are the ones who have been broken and put ourselves back together with gold in the cracks, making ourselves more beautiful for having been shattered. We are the ones who know that transformation always requires pain, but that the pain is worth it for what we become. Together, their voices harmonizing in a way that made the air shimmer, they spoke the final blessing. May we never forget that love is not a feeling, but a choice. Not a destination, but a journey. Not a weakness, but the greatest strength in all the realms of existence. May we have the courage to love across every boundary, through every difficulty, beyond every fear. And may our love make all things new. The sun rose over the bridge house, painting everything in shades of gold that reminded Alara of heaven's light, but filtered through the mercy of Earth's atmosphere. She stood with Cassiel, their hands joined, their hearts beating in rhythm, their souls intertwined in ways that transcended both mortality and divinity. "We did it," she whispered. "We really did it." "We're still doing it," Cassiel corrected gently. "Every day, every moment, every breath. This isn't an ending, love. It's just another beginning." And he was right. Because the work of bridging worlds is never finished. There are always new barriers to overcome, new fears to transcend, new ways that love can manifest and transform and heal. The story of Alara and Cassiel wasn't special because it was unique, but because it was a template, a blueprint, a proof of concept that anyone could follow if they had the courage. In the years that followed, more bridges were built. Between not just angels and humans, but between all the divided aspects of existence. Between mind and heart, reason and intuition, action and contemplation. Between different religions, different cultures, different ways of understanding the sacred. Between science and spirituality, discovering that they were never truly opposed but merely different languages describing the same ultimate reality. The bridge house grew, spawning sister communities around the world. Places where people could come to remember their connection to the divine, to each other, to the living earth that sustained them all. Places where miracles were normalized and the impossible became routine. Not because the laws of physics were suspended, but because people remembered how to see the divine magic that had always been operating beneath the surface of ordinary reality. Alara and Cassiel grew older in body, though the grace they carried kept them vital and strong far beyond normal human years. They watched generations pass through the bridge house, children growing into adults who carried the work forward, creating innovations and approaches they never would have imagined. One evening, as they sat in their garden in the twilight of their lives, watching the latest group of children practice their gifts, Alara felt a shift in the air. She looked up to see the ancient angel who had first judged them in the Hall of Judgment, the one who had become an unlikely ally and friend. "I've come to tell you something," the angel said, its voice gentler than Alara had ever heard it. "In the highest councils of heaven, they're calling what you started the Great Reconciliation. They say it's the most significant event since creation itself, the moment when the divine and mortal finally began to work together as they were always meant to." "We didn't do anything special," Alara protested, as she always did. "We just loved each other." "That," the angel said with something that was definitely a smile, "is exactly what makes it special. You didn't try to change the world through power or wisdom or grand plans. You simply refused to let love be defeated by law, and everything else followed. You proved that the most revolutionary act in all of existence is to love completely, without reservation, without fear of consequence." The angel looked between them, its ancient eyes warm. "Heaven is different now because of you. We've learned to feel, to change, to grow. We've discovered that our eternal perfection was actually a kind of death, and that the mortality we pitied is actually where true life exists. You've given us the greatest gift, the ability to become more than we were." "And Earth?" Cassiel asked. "What has changed there?" "Everything and nothing," the angel replied. "The world still has suffering and pain, still has injustice and cruelty. Those things cannot be erased by any amount of divine grace, because they arise from the freedom that gives existence its meaning, But people no longer face those things alone. They know now, in their bones, that heaven is not distant and indifferent, that they carry divinity within themselves, that they are capable of miracles if they have the courage to attempt them. The angel prepared to depart, its form beginning to fade back into the invisible realms. But before it disappeared completely, it spoke one last time. Thank you for everything you sacrificed, for everything you endured, for everything you taught us about the nature of love. Heaven is in your debt, and that is a debt we will spend eternity trying to repay. After it left, Elara and Cassiel sat in comfortable silence, letting the twilight deepen around them. The garden was quiet, except for the soft sounds of children's laughter in the distance, the rustle of wings both physical and ethereal, the gentle music that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Do you think we've done enough? Elara asked. Do you think we've fulfilled whatever purpose we were meant to serve? Cassiel considered, his hand finding hers in the darkness. I think we could live 1,000 lifetimes and never finish the work we started. But I also think that's not our responsibility. We planted seeds. We broke ground. We showed that change was possible. Now it's up to others to continue the cultivation, to see what grows from what we began. I'm tired, Elara admitted. Not in my soul, but in my body. This mortal form has carried divine grace for longer than it was meant to, and I can feel it wearing thin. I know, Cassiel said softly, and she heard the grief in his voice even as he tried to hide it. I can feel it too. But Elara, I want you to know, whatever comes next, wherever you go, I'm coming with you. I didn't fall from heaven just to lose you to death. If you return to dust, I'll become dust with you. If you transform into pure spirit, I'll be right there beside you. If there's an afterlife beyond even what we know, we'll discover it together. Elara smiled in the darkness, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Together. Always together. That's what we promised, isn't it? In this life and beyond it, across every realm that exists, and every one that doesn't yet. You and me, bridging worlds, teaching others how to love without limits. Always, Cassiel agreed, and his wings wrapped around them both, a shelter against the gathering night. They sat that way for a long time, two souls who had changed the cosmos simply by refusing to accept that they had to be apart. Two hearts that beat in rhythm across the boundary between mortality and eternity. Two lights that had burned so brightly they had illuminated new paths for all who came after them. The children in the bridge house would remember this night. They would speak of how they looked out their windows and saw Elara and Cassiel in the garden, glowing with a light that was neither wholly divine nor wholly human, but something beautifully between. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the moment when that light grew so bright, it seemed to consume everything. And when it faded, the garden was empty, but more beautiful than it had ever been. Every flower blooming in colors that had no names. Every blade of grass humming with a frequency that made the heart remember something it had never known. Some said Elara and Cassiel had finally returned to heaven, their work on earth complete. Others insisted they had chosen to remain, but had transcended physical form to become pure spirit, still present but invisible except to those with eyes to truly see. A few whispered that they had achieved something unprecedented, a perfect fusion of mortal and divine, becoming something entirely new that would set the pattern for all future evolution of consciousness. The truth, as with all the deepest truths, was probably beyond any single explanation. But what mattered was not where they had gone, but what they had left behind. A world forever changed by their love, a heaven forever enriched by their courage, and a blueprint for how any soul, mortal or divine, could choose to bridge the impossible divide between what is and what could be. In the years that followed, people would come to the garden where Elara and Cassiel had sat that final night. They would sit in silence, feeling the presence that still lingered there, a warmth that spoke of love that had burned so bright it had permanently altered the fabric of reality. Some would have visions. Some would hear voices. Some would simply feel a profound sense of peace, of rightness, of connection to something vast and beautiful. And occasionally, on certain nights when the veil between worlds grew thin, people would swear they could see them, a woman and an angel, walking hand in hand through the garden, visiting the place they had transformed through nothing more than their refusal to accept that love must bow to law. They would be laughing, these witnesses reported, their faces radiant with joy, their forms shifting between solid and translucent, between human and divine, between here and elsewhere. Whether these were genuine visitations or projections of human hope and longing, no one could say for certain. But it didn't really matter, because the story of Alara and Cassiel had become something more than history. It had become myth, and myths have a power that transcends mere factual truth. They shape how we see the world, how we understand ourselves, what we believe is possible. And the myth of the woman who carried heaven's curse in her veins for 5 years, who refused to accept that grace could be anything other than a gift, who walked into the very heart of paradise and demanded the release of her beloved, who proved that love could indeed bridge any divide and overcome any obstacle. That myth changed everything. Children were raised hearing the story, learning from it that they should never accept limitations placed on their love, their dreams, their potential. That what the world calls impossible is often just difficult, waiting for someone brave enough to attempt it. That the boundary between human and divine is not a wall, but a threshold, waiting to be crossed. The Bridge House continued its work long after Alara and Cassiel's departure, becoming not just a physical place, but a symbol of what was possible when fear was set aside and love allowed to lead. Thousands passed through its doors, learning to carry more grace than they had thought possible, to see the divine in the ordinary, to be themselves bridges between heaven and earth. And slowly, across generations, the world shifted. Not into some utopia where all suffering ended. That was never the point, and would have required the removal of freedom that gave life its meaning. But into a world where people understood their connection to the divine, where angels walked openly among humans not as superior beings but as partners in the great work of creation, where the artificial boundaries that had divided existence for so long were replaced by fluid connections and creative collaborations. The Great Reconciliation, as Heaven's councils called it, became the defining event of an entire age. Historians marked time from it, before reconciliation and after reconciliation. Theologians built entire systems of thought around its implications. Philosophers debated its meaning. Artists created works inspired by its beauty. And ordinary people, going about their daily lives, felt its effects in ways they might not even recognize, in the sudden intuition that led them to call a friend in need, in the unexpected kindness of strangers, in the way beauty could still break through suffering and remind them that life was worth living. And at the heart of it all, in every telling and retelling, in every variation and interpretation, stood the same simple truth, that love, when given freely and completely, has the power to transform not just individuals, but entire cosmos. That what begins as two souls refusing to be separated can ripple out until it changes the fundamental structure of reality itself. Alara had carried heaven's curse in her veins for 5 years, or so she had thought. But what she had really carried was a seed, and when it finally bloomed, reaching from her heart to Cassiel's across all the barriers of creation, it proved what should have been obvious all along, that love is the most powerful force in existence, and nothing, not law, not death, not the infinite distance between heaven and earth, can ultimately stand against it. That seed continued to grow, long after the gardeners who planted it had moved beyond sight. It grew in the hearts of everyone who heard the story and dared to believe it. It grew in the spaces between worlds, in the connections being formed every day between mortal and divine. It grew in the children born to the new covenant, who would never know a time when love was forbidden or connection impossible. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the reach of mortal senses or even angelic perception, in a place that was both heaven and earth and neither, Alara and Cassiel still tended that garden. still welcomed souls who found their way there, still taught by their presence that love is not just an emotion, but a fundamental force of the universe, as real as gravity and as powerful as creation itself. The story might have ended 1,000 different ways, with tragedy and separation, with triumph and return to heaven, with transformation into pure spirit, or dissolution into the elements. But it ended, as all the best stories do, with possibility, with the assurance that what began with them would continue long after they were gone, with the promise that every soul, mortal or divine, carries within them the same potential for transformation, the same capacity for love that transcends all boundaries. She carried heaven's curse in her veins for 5 years, until it reached the Angel King's heart. And in that reaching, in that connection, in that absolute refusal to accept that love must have limits, she changed not just her own life, or even Cassiel's life, but the very nature of existence itself. And that, perhaps, is the greatest miracle of all. Not that angels can love humans, or that humans can carry divine grace, but that love itself, simple, stubborn, beautiful love, has the power to rewrite the rules of reality and make the impossible not just possible, but inevitable. For wherever love is given freely, completely, without reservation or fear of consequence, there heaven and earth meet. There the divine becomes human, and the human touches the divine. There the curse becomes a blessing, the separation becomes a reunion, and the old laws give way to new possibilities that none could have imagined before someone was brave enough, or foolish enough, to simply love without limits. And so the story ends, but also continues, because stories like this never truly end. They echo through time, inspiring others to take up the work, to build their own bridges, to love their own impossible loves, to carry grace through their own years of darkness until it finally reaches the hearts that need it most. The garden still blooms. The bridge house still stands. And somewhere, always, there is someone hearing this story for the first time and thinking, if they could do it, perhaps I can too. If their love could bridge heaven and earth, perhaps mine can overcome whatever obstacles stand in my way. And in that thinking, in that first spark of belief that the impossible might not be impossible after all, the work continues. The seed grows. The reconciliation deepens. And love, eternal and inexhaustible, keeps building bridges between all the divided parts of existence, one brave heart at a time. This is the story of how heaven's curse became heaven's greatest gift, of how separation became the beginning of the deepest union, of how a mortal woman and an angel taught all of creation that love is not bound by any law, defeated by any distance, or limited by any boundary between worlds. And this, ultimately, is the invitation the story extends to all who hear it, to love with that same courage, that same stubbornness, that same absolute refusal to accept that anything at all, is more powerful than two souls who choose each other and will not be divided. Heaven and earth will never be the same, and neither will we. Having learned that we all carry within us the power to bridge worlds, to transform curses into blessings, to make the impossible inevitable through nothing more than our willingness to love completely. The story ends here, but the work continues. In your heart, in your choices, in your own capacity to love across whatever divides might separate you from those you cherish. Alara and Cassiel showed us the way. Now it's our turn to walk it, to build our own bridges, to carry our own grace until it reaches the hearts that need it most. And perhaps, if we're brave enough, we too might discover that what we thought was a curse was actually a calling, that what felt like separation was actually preparation, and that love has always had the power to change everything. May we all have the courage to carry grace through our years of darkness. May we all be stubborn enough to refuse the limits others place on our love. And may we all discover, in our own time and in our own way, that we are each capable of bridging heaven and earth, if only we dare to try.